idea in my presentation for today. I actually am kind of a clinical behavior analyst. What I do is assessment and treatment of problem behavior. And I've noticed in doing assessment and treatment of problem behavior that I have a lot of effective treatments in my little toolkit, right? And I go out and I train people to do these treatments and I walk away. And then what happens? I come back and what are those folks doing?
Nada.
Nada. Not what I asked them to do whatsoever, right? Maybe they're doing something, but it's certainly not what I asked. And as a result of those sorts of experiences, I decided that probably one of the things I needed to do is just look at how well do staff implement these various procedures. So, Claire and a lot of other folks in the track today have been talking about training and feedback and these sorts of things and how to improve performance. I'm not there yet. I'm just trying to see where performance is currently at. Where I'm going is then how do I improve performance. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of background about what I'm going to talk about and why I'm showing these particular data today. Okay, so the study that I am going to describe focuses on the consistency, right, or the treatment integrity of staff implementation of a couple of different common treatments for problem behavior. So, two commonly used treatments for problem behavior exhibited by individuals with developmental disabilities are non-contingent reinforcement and differential reinforcement of other behavior. In both procedures, the reinforcer that maintains problem behavior is typically the one that is delivered. So NCR involves the delivery of a reinforcer on a time-based, response-independent schedule, whereas DRO entails the delivery of the reinforcer for the absence of the target problem behavior for a specified period of time. One variation of DRO, interval DRO, requires that the individual go without exhibiting the problem behavior for the entire interval, whatever that interval may be. Another variation, momentary DRO, only requires the absence of the problem behavior at the moment that that interval elapses. Vollmer, Iwata, Zarconi, Smith, and Mazalewski, that's a mouthful, compared the effects of NCR and a resetting interval DRO schedule on self-injurious behavior that was maintained by social positive reinforcement. And they found that both of these procedures are equally effective. Great, now we have choice, right? So, there are probably some additional factors that will influence the selection of a treatment, right? Which one do we pick? Do we pick the NCR or do we pick the DRO? Several researchers have suggested that NCR may be easier for the staff to implement because it doesn't require this continuous monitoring of the behavior throughout the entire interval. And momentary DRO is similar to NCR in this respect in that it also does not require this continuous monitoring. So, if these particular treatments are easier to implement, right, it should follow that those particular treatments are implemented with a higher degree of consistency than those that are more difficult to carry out. However, there is no comparison of the integrity of that I'm aware of the integrity of DRO and NCR as treatments for problem behavior reported in the literature. So, the purpose of this study was to examine the consistency with which interval DRO, FMDRO, and NCR were implemented by direct care staff. In addition, we also varied the rate of problem behavior to determine its effects on implementation errors. Subjects consisted of direct care staff members at a day program or a group home for clients with developmental disabilities. Sessions lasted 10 minutes in length and were either conducted in a therapy room in the day program or at the dining room table of the group home. Now, the ideal context for comparing these sorts of procedures would consist of an actual clinical intervention, right, in which the therapist attempted to decrease some problem behaviors. However, that would result in some uncontrolled variation in both the topography, what the response looks like, right, and the frequency of the problem behaviors. And it would make it pretty impossible to compare these procedures under similar conditions. And it would also limit the number of observations that could be conducted because we could only conduct observations when problem behavior was occurring. So therefore, to ensure that client and response characteristics remain constant across all of the conditions, two trained undergraduate students played the role of Confederate clients during each session in which they followed a precise script that determined the distribution of problem behavior throughout that session. The Confederates were cued to emit these behaviors via a reported prompt from their MP3 player headphones during the session. And observers collected data on client problem behaviors to ensure that the Confederates were actually following the script. So our main dependent variable was a percentage correct measure based on the number of opportunities for delivering a reinforcer during the session, which was always a predetermined fixed number. Remember, we had these implementation of DRO consists of delivering a reinforcer if the client meets criteria for reinforcement, that is, the problem behavior did not occur, okay? And correct implementation of NCR consists of delivering a reinforcer when the time interval clocks out. Staff can deliver reinforcers at non-scheduled times, and they can also make different types of errors at scheduled times. So we took data on 2 different types of errors in treatment implementation. Errors of omission occurred when the staff member did not deliver reinforcement in the form of a token when they should have, that is, when the client earned it, so when the DRO interval clocked out without the occurrence of problem behavior, or when the NCR interval timed out. Errors of commission occurred when the staff member delivered reinforcement when they should not have. So for example, if problem behavior occurred during the DRO interval and they delivered reinforcement, or if they delivered reinforcement at some time other than when the NCR interval clocked out. So observers recorded data on the frequency of both of these types of errors during continuous 10-second intervals, and the number of errors admitted by the subjects across the 3 treatment procedures was compared to determine the relative consistency with which they implemented each of these treatments. As I mentioned, the Confederates had scripts, so I want to tell you a little bit about those scripts. The target problem behavior that the staff member was contemplating was head hitting. To simulate conditions under which clients might engage in a variety of behaviors, however, we wanted them to do other things besides head hitting. So we also programmed property destruction, aggression, appropriate toy manipulation, and appropriate social behavior directed towards the other client in the room. At no time did the clients initiate any interaction with the staff member. Total behavior emitted by the target client in all conditions was 6 responses per minute. What we varied was how much of the target problem behavior was occurring. So during the low rate conditions, the target client emitted head hitting at a rate of 1 response per minute, and then all those other topographies of behavior that I mentioned at a rate of 5 responses per minute. During the high rate conditions, the target client emitted head hitting at a rate of 5 responses per minute, and then all those other behaviors at a rate of about 1 response per minute. And then across conditions, the non-target client peer, that is the one who isn't receiving any consequences from the staff member, or distractor, emitted behavior at about 2 responses per minute. So the staff member received some individualized training on how to implement a treatment program for a particular problem behavior, in this case head hitting, for one of 2 clients that were going to be in the room, the target client. Training just included a very brief explanation of the types of reinforcers that may maintain problem behavior, and how one might implement DRO and NCR. In addition, prior to each session, the trainer modeled the use of DRO or NCR, whichever was being conducted, and allowed the subject to ask any questions about the implementation of the procedures. The following phases were conducted in a multi-element design with the order of the conditions randomized. NCR, FMDRO, and interval DRO, each with a low rate of problem behavior, and NCR, FMDRO, and interval DRO, each with a high rate of problem behavior. I'm going to actually just be showing some representative data so as not to bore you to death with all of my graphs. These are data for Kate. Hopefully everybody can see that clearly. The top graph here shows total errors per minute on the y-axis, and we have sessions on the x-axis here. So as you can see, Kate only made errors in the 2 interval DRO conditions. Interval DRO with a high rate of problem behavior, which is here, and interval DRO with a low rate of problem behavior, here. The bottom graph is a stacked bar graph that shows the type of errors that occurred in each condition. So what we have on the y-axis is percent of trials with an error, and on the x-axis we have the various conditions. The solid portions of the bar represent errors, percent of trials with an error of commission, and I don't know what you call that, the spotted portion of the bar represents percent of trials with an error of omission. So what we see here for Kate is that the majority of errors that occurred in the interval DRO condition with a high rate of problem behavior were errors of commission, right? So she's delivering reinforcers even though the client engaged in some problem behavior. For the interval DRO with a low rate of problem behavior, we see about equal levels of errors of omission and commission. So she's making both types of errors. These are data for Anna. Anna made the most errors in the interval DRO with a high rate of problem behavior condition, and most of these errors were errors of commission. But as you can see on this bottom graph, I'm not sure if you all can see that scale, it only goes to 50%. So the percent of trials with an error is pretty low overall across all the conditions, even though we did see more errors occurring in the interval DRO with a high rate. data are interesting to me because they show the effects of all three variables: treatment type, rate of problem behavior, and the error type. So she made more mistakes in the DRO conditions. This is DRO with a high rate of problem behavior, DRO with a low rate of problem behavior, and also some mistakes in the FM DRO with a high rate of problem behavior, as compared to the NCR conditions, which are the conditions in the blue. So we see her making no mistakes in those conditions. In the DRO conditions, her errors were primarily errors of commission, that is, delivering a reinforcer even though problem behavior occurred. But her errors in the momentary DRO conditions were errors of omission, that is, failing to deliver the reinforcer even though the client was not engaged in the problem behavior at the moment that the interval elapsed. These are data for Emily. Emily made more errors in the DRO conditions generally than the NCR conditions. So the pink and the green data paths are our DRO conditions, and the NCR is in blue. What we see in terms of errors of omission and commission is that you see both in the interval DRO conditions, but you see more errors of omission in the FM DRO conditions as compared to commission. So rather than show you all the graphs, I thought I would put the data in a table. What you're looking at here is the percent of childs with an error by condition for each subject. So the orange boxes indicate the condition with the highest percentage of errors for that particular subject. By far, interval DRO was the most problematic condition. 7 of 8 subjects had the largest number of errors in one of the interval DRO conditions. The fewest errors were made in the NCR conditions, and this was true for every subject with the exception of Taylor. And actually, 3 of 8 subjects never made an error in any of their NCR sessions. Same data, shown a different way. This graph shows the percent of trials with an error for each condition for all of the subjects. So the majority of errors that were made in the interval DRO condition across the subjects were errors of commission, right? So the subject delivered a token to the client at the end of the interval, even though the client engaged in problem behavior in the interval. By contrast, most of the errors that occurred in the FM DRO conditions were errors of omission. That is, the subject simply failed to deliver a token to the client at the end of the interval, even though the client was not engaged in the problem behavior at the moment that the interval elapsed. All of the errors that were made in the NCR conditions were errors of omission. In these cases, the staff member just simply did not deliver a token when the timer signaled the end of the interval. Reached over, turned the timer off, no token delivery. Before I actually talk about the implications of these data, I have to admit that the generality of these findings is limited because we're talking about an experimental simulation here. In order to equate these treatment conditions based on the number of opportunities to commit both types of errors and to observe performance under varying rates of problem behavior, the sessions in this study did not involve real clients, they did not involve real problem behaviors, and they were not conducted in the context of ongoing activities that you typically see in a treatment setting, right? Furthermore, we informed the staff that we were taking data on their implementation of these procedures, and there's certainly been some talk in this track about reactivity, right? So we did all these things by design because we really wanted to make sure that the only variables that were changing were the rate of problem behavior and the treatment that was being implemented. So all of this certainly raises the possibility that the performance that we saw was more or less optimal, right? That is, you might expect fewer errors in simulated sessions where staff are being told that their behavior is being observed, right? But nevertheless, as you saw in the graphs, we still saw plenty of errors even under these conditions. So now I want to talk a little bit about the implications of these sorts of errors of these various treatments. The majority of the errors during the interval DRO were errors of commission. This is a big problem for any of you who work in the treatment of problem behavior, right? Why is this a problem? Well, because if those errors are occurring at a high rate, what that means is that staff members are delivering reinforcement even though the problem behavior has occurred during the interval. And that might actually strengthen or maintain the problem behavior. The majority of the errors that we saw during the NCR and the FMDRO conditions were errors of omission. And these errors are less of a problem because in this case, it just means that the client is going for a longer period of time without access to the reinforcer. Now, if we're using the functional reinforcer, the one that maintains problem behavior, frequent failures to deliver those reinforcers might actually evoke problem behavior by way of an establishing operation, that is deprivation from reinforcement. But at worst, they're going to approximate extinction, and we're not going to be inadvertently reinforcing problem behavior. Peter Pickett et al. Recently published a series of experiments designed to determine the individual effects of errors of omission and commission on problem behavior and communicative responses during a DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior treatment. So they define these errors of omission as failing to reinforce the alternative response, and errors of commission as reinforcing the problem behavior. And what they found was that errors of omission produced reductions in the alternative response, but no real increase in problem behavior. However, errors of commission did produce increases in problem behavior, but these increases were not significant until the errors resulted in a treatment being implemented with only about 40% consistency. So those results would suggest that staff can actually make a large number of errors and still have the treatment for problem behavior actually be effective. However, the treatment that Claire evaluated in that study was a DRA, so we don't actually know if similar error levels would be acceptable during the implementation of a DRO or an NCR. So what does all of this stuff mean in terms of selecting a treatment for a client with problem behavior? First, the results indicate that NCR was, in fact, actually associated with lower error rates than DRO, which provides some empirical support for this idea that NCR might be easier for staff to implement than DRO. FMDRO might be a good choice and better than interval DRO, but only if it's effective in actually reducing problem behavior. Most staff members in this study made fewer errors during the FMDRO conditions than they did during the interval DRO, though we still did see some errors. Finally, the most common form of DRO, the interval DRO, resulted in the largest number of errors. And if you really want to use that as a treatment for problem behavior, my recommendation would be to pilot test its effectiveness when it's implemented inconsistently or inaccurately. The last slide was the end of the presentation I actually had prepared. But just this Monday, we finished collecting data on our first subject in a follow-up study. Goodbye, Amanda. I'm going to call attention to Amanda just to pick on her. Amanda has to leave because Amanda is actually currently a subject in this follow-up study, so I don't want her to see what we're up to. Thanks, Amanda. So I thought we would show this one data set. Here is Amanda, actually.
She's looking through the peephole.
Yeah, I'm sure she is. I don't have her data, but I don't want her to be aware of precisely what we're up to. The purpose of the follow-up study is just to replicate these procedures that we used in kind of this analog artificial setup in the natural environment setting. So all of our subjects are going to be master's students in the ADA program at Florida Tech, which I would kick them all out if I thought they were all from these subjects, but you guys can stay, who are also employed at the Scott Center for Autism Treatment. The clients that we're going to use in this study will be real clients this time around. They will be individuals who attend the Scott Center and are receiving early intervention, discrete trial training programming, and who engage in stereotypy or some other form of problem behavior. The dependent variables are the same as the previous study, so errors of omission, errors of commission, and correct implementation. Sessions will initially be conducted in the therapy room. The staff member is going to be instructed to ignore the client except when they are delivering reinforcers. So the only thing they have to do is whatever the treatment is for the problem behavior. For the first client, the initial DRO and NCR interval was set at 30 seconds based on the level of problem behavior and baseline, and then we increased it to 60 seconds to make the intervention more practical for use in the natural environment. So once we see stable responding in the therapy room, the staff member will then be asked to implement the different treatments for stereotypy while also implementing the client's regular discrete trial programming in the natural setting. So now we're getting close to, okay, so we've got this analog thing, let's see what staff do. Now let's actually ask them to implement these things in the real environment with real clients, right? So again, the three treatments we're going to evaluate in this study are the same as the previous: interval DRO, FMDRO, NCR. And during each session, staff will be given 20 opportunities to respond. That is, the timer will go off 20 times and we will record what they do. So these are data for Abby, our first subject. The graph shows percent of trials with an error on the y-axis and sessions on the x-axis. There are no data in baseline. This is actually a baseline of client problem behavior, which I'm not showing, but we are also taking data on the effects of these implementation errors on client behavior. So as you can see, in all of these phases, the largest percent of errors are occurring in the interval DRO condition. Right? And Abby's data actually closely mirror the results for some of the subjects that I just showed you from the analog environment, in that more errors are occurring in the DRO conditions as compared to NCR. When we actually, the interesting part of this, so this is all the ignore context, The interesting part of this is this last phase here, the discrete trial. So this is the part where we actually asked the subject to go run the regular discrete trial programming and these treatments were stereotyping. Again, what we see are elevated levels of errors in the DRO condition, but we also see some errors emerge in the momentary DRO condition as well during the discrete trial program. So we're going to continue running this and see if we see similar effects across some additional subjects, low levels of errors in the NCR and elevated errors in the DRO conditions. Once I have those data at hand, then I'll begin focusing on the staff performance issues. How do we increase their performance while they implement?